Hello and welcome to, I don't know, Thank You Fellows podcast. I think this is probably Thank You Fellows podcast. My name is Caleb Keith, and today I am joined by my father, Scott Keith, and by Adam Francisco. We are doing a sort of, I don't know if a response is the right word, a reaction.
I think reaction.
A reaction. We're doing a reaction video.
A response implies that we have like corrections, and I don't really have any corrections.
But we're just reacting and commenting on the Wesley Huff appearance on Joe Rogan.
This is a big thing, apparently. Is it accurate to say that the whole thing went viral?
I think it's totally accurate to say that. In at least the general online realm, especially I would say Christian social media sphere, and it sounds like broader. As of finishing watching it last night, the video had 3 million views.
That seems viral. I'm not good at gauging what viral means since I don't really see a lot of the stuff. But I had heard several people talk about it, like not just online, but outside in the IRL, as they say, in real life, talk about it.
What I heard is that it is the most viewed presentation of the gospel ever online because of the millions of views across the platforms.
That's interesting.
So
wow.
I don't know how to verify
on
that.
Joe Rogan's podcast. That's awesome.
Yeah, Adam's like, I'm Joe Rogan from way back just because of jiu-jitsu.
Yeah, well, I mean, I've long been. He had Stephen Meyer from Discovery Institute on. It was less than a year ago, I think, and that was a really great interview. It was primarily over his book, The Return of the God Hypothesis, and there was a little bit where they went past the book, and Meyer was able to give a defense of the historicity of the resurrection, if memory serves me correctly. But this one goes much deeper, and in the last, it's not even 24 hours since we first heard about this and decided we were going to record on it, right? I've watched probably 6 hours of stuff or listened to 6 hours of stuff just to try to understand, what the heck's happening? How did this all unfold? Because it's one thing that's curious about Joe Rogan, I think, is, first of all, we probably have to say, like, for some of our listeners, if you watch this thing, you got to be ready for some, not from Wes Huff, but from Joe Rogan, vulgar language that's sort of normal. Joe Rogan.
Yeah, well, Thinking Fellows language when the mics aren't on.
Well, I mean, let's not go that far. But
I thought it made it sound like this Christian apologist Wesley Huff was actually having a conversation with a real guy.
Yeah, and the thing with Joe Rogan is that he's just a good example of a guy who really does believe there is truth that can be understood. So he's always he's open to all sorts of things, even wild and crazy things, alien kind of stuff, but he's an example of one of the sort of like what we might call a good agnostic, in that he's willing to have the conversation and willing to listen without an agenda and at least take the evidence or an argument seriously, or as serious as somebody like Joe Rogan can with somebody who's got a PhD in. Well, I don't even know. I don't remember what his specialty is, but text criticism type of stuff.
It seemed like about 2 hours in, there's this point where Joe goes on a rant against what C.S. Lewis called chronological snobbery. Against the idea that we can know for certain all sorts of things that we can't know for certain. And he's basically he was going at hard atheist when he did this. But the same thing kind of came up when he was talking about sort of the new views on dark matter and how scientists, when they're really doing science, have to be willing to change their opinion all the time. But what's the scary thing about that is that, in that section, they're talking about the new views on dark matter, but they didn't really bring up that this was talked about as certainty. Like the previous view has been talked about as certainty until sort of the new evidence come out. And I think they touched on that a little bit, how frustrating it can be to the rest of us when we've had shows on this, when science oversteps. And
every 10 years something is true. Just uniformly, unarguably true, and then 10 years later, those same people come and tell you that thing was false.
Yeah. It's supposed to be empirical. It's supposed to be open to the evidence. You're supposed to talk about it in probabilistic language, and it's spoken of as certainty, and then it changes. And the funny thing was on the dark matter one is that the way and I'm not even sure he was describing the new theory right. He probably was or wasn't, I don't know. But the way he was describing it, the first thing my mind went to is like age of the earth stuff. How, everybody says the earth has to be this much older because we know this and this. And one of the big ones that's used is how long it takes for light to get from a star that's far, far away to here, that it can't happen in this amount of time. And I'm like, okay, but in the space between universes, time works differently, huh?
I think, Huff was very kind to him on even those kinds of things, because you could tell he knew that those kinds of theories is a speculative type of science, not an empirical type of science, which is coming up with hypotheses to meet needs as things get trampled. And so then they're always filling in a gap when some other piece doesn't work. It's basically like writing a space novel. Yeah. And Huff was just like very kind. He was like, "Oh, that stuff is crazy,
and I'm not a scientist." And that was good. He's like, "I'm not a scientist, so you're outside my lane here."
And moved Joe to that
bit. His lane, though, is an interesting and very specific lane. And Adam, I think you'll appreciate this. The thing I loved about the guy is that he's got a real specific lane. Like you technically do, I technically do, but whoever educated this man, I would guess, starting with undergrad forward, like Rod did to us and to Caleb even to some extent, taught him to be a theological generalist too. This guy could have conversations on wide-ranging topics that were not just his very narrow and very specific specialty. And I really appreciated that, because that is not something that everybody can do, and he was very good at it.
Yeah. Well, I tell you what, the one thing I didn't like about the interview is the way it made me feel about myself. I was like, here's this 33-year-old guy, and I've subsequently learned he has 3 kids. I just assumed he didn't have kids, so he didn't have that sort of distraction.
He talked about at least his wife.
Yeah, well, and he's just absolutely brilliant and real. I mean, he embodied the exhortation to always be prepared, and he was definitely more than prepared to give a reason for the hope within you and to do it with gentleness and respect.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I was like, man, I've really failed.
But that's ridiculous.
That's just me being self-loathing.
That's ridiculous. If the certain amount of things that this guy couldn't control and that you couldn't control, and you ended up on a platform like that, you'd be very willing and very able to have that kind of conversation where you are with kindness and gentleness defending the faith, because you've done it your whole life. That's ridiculous.
I do think the thing that people find...
I was in Britain for 3 years, and they're all self-loathing, so I kind of picked that up from them. But
you really did.
I'm okay now. Kelsey,
you really did.
Kelsey helped talk me off the ledge a little earlier. So Kelsey from 1517.
So I think the thing that made the interview impactful, why it's getting circulated more than past apologists, or even the initial debate, which got him on this with Billy Carson, is the thing that people sometimes find frustrating about Rogan, which is that he's willing to have people on that he isn't arguing with primarily. He'll ask questions. He might even ask a clarifying question or question that implies he believes something different than the host. Like he did that when it came to the resurrection and evolution. Some other things, and evolution.
When he starts talking to him about I forgot which sort of pre-Neanderthal.
But Rogan doesn't come on there to argue a lot, and he's willing to just let the host's position or the guest's position stand as they present it and get corrected later. Joe has had many interviews where so-and-so comes on, then somebody else comes on and corrects them, and then somebody else a year later says something different, and just sort of let the information stand so that the audience can hear the information. And I know that people find that frustrating because they're waiting for Rogan to pick a side when it comes to the various different sides of the coin he's done, whether it's on politics, pick Democrat or Republican, dude. Why do you have Bernie and Trump on? Why have people who do this evolution and aliens and all this stuff, and then these Christian apologists that But that's what made it so that somebody could give a very, what I would call, normal, simple presentation of apologetics, like especially the last hour where it got specific. There was nothing, and this is not insulting, there was nothing extraordinary or special about the arguments. They were the standard evidential and textual arguments for the resurrection, for the reliability of the New Testament, for the transmission of the Christian faith.
As for instance, when Rogan was saying, how do you know Jesus actually died on the cross? Did he actually die? And then he gives this case. There was recently a guy who was going to have his organs harvested, and he's on the table, and they're about to harvest his organs. All of a sudden, he wakes up and like, I'm alive. And he's like, couldn't that have happened to Jesus? And so Huff starts going into, all this common stuff we would do. Romans are very good at crucifixion. They were specialties at it. He's doing the common stuff, and I'm sitting there. I was on a run at the time, and I'm sitting there like jogging along, going, "Okay, bring up the pericardial sac, bring up the piercing of the heart and the heart sac, bring up the Journal of American Medicine Association article. Just bring up this stuff that we've all been kind of like taught to bring up." And eventually, he at least got around to the article. He didn't get around to the specifics of the article that actually talked about how they could know forensically from the reporting that Jesus was died by a couple of things, including the pierced side and the puncturing of the pericardial sac and blood and water flowing out, meaning that his heart had stopped and circulation had ceased. But he did all this kind of stuff that Caleb said is like, if you've got a little bit of evidential apologetics training, you've heard this before, you've done this before, and it isn't like extraordinary in a sense. It's probably not,
it just means
10,000 people in the world that could do it. Maybe there are, but there's
the space,
enough.
The space to let that breathe
was great.
Where it's,
and I'm not criticizing Huff, by the way. I thought he did an excellent job.
Where it's been so impactful is, funny enough, not just like this argument or debate or, going to your friend who hates Christianity and yelling at them about some journal article. It was just like, do the normal stuff, but on a platform where people listen to Joe Rogan to just hear information tossed out into the open and sort of question for themselves whether it's true or not. And so there's some...
Well, and when you're on a platform like that, you got to keep it, not to sound too bro-y here, you got to keep it real. Or, the number of listeners in the first 10 minutes of the show and the number of the minutes in the listeners in the last 10 minutes of the show is going to be dramatically different.
Yeah.
If you've lost, in this case, millions of people along the way because you can't just speak like a person.
Yeah.
So I do think for like 1517, for apologists that we know and stuff, and even to what you were saying, Adam, a lot of this is like the be prepared, because maybe that opportunity will happen. There's nothing it doesn't seem like Huff was like spending every waking minute figuring out how to get on Joe Rogan to do this. And so
does some good work with that Canadian Institute of Apologetics or whatever it is. That was animation.
Yeah.
That's great.
In my head, I'm thinking the whole time, I'm like, how much does this did this cost him? I'm like, how could we do this? But were you guys amazed at Joe Rogan's, especially when it came to ancient civilizations? I was really amazed at how much Joe Rogan knew about this stuff. You can tell he has a real passion for.
Well, and he's had a lot of people on the show who talked about this kind of thing too. Like one of the things to be Joe Rogan is you can get any expert, like any mega expert on any mega topic or minor topic. You can call them up and say, "Hey, do you want to come on my show?" and get millions of people exposed to what you do. Chances are they're going to say yes. And so, like, he's had aliens people on, he's had ancient people on. He had the Billy Carson guy on, right? Mm-hmm. And it's like he's exposed to a lot of this, which is what an amazing position to be in. I'm not sure he would phrase it this way, but I really appreciate Rogan's epistemological humility. Like it was really good to hear him just say, there are things that we think we can know, things we can know, and things that we just can't know. And you gotta be pretty humble about that. And I was like, man, I'm not sure you could ask for more than that in somebody that you're having an apologetic conversation with.
Yeah. Did you see the part where Wes Huff had actually made facsimiles of, I think it was P-52, yes. I think it was two different
gives him gifts. It was amazing.
This is just bananas, as Joe Rogan was referring to. Just how incredible this thing went.
Well, maybe he sells those things on his website too. Now I want one.
Oh yeah.
That'd be
the pocket copy of the Gospel of John. That was rad.
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought that was.
Yeah, I really
walk around with an ancient Greek
nerding
or
up.
a pocket copy of the Gospel of John, and somebody asks you a question.
Yeah. I was nerding out on when he was getting into all that textual variants and manuscripts.
Yeah,
and
I thought you would be.
I forget what his particular field, what he called it, but where he's a specialist in
space between spaces.
the space between. So you've got a fragment, you got those what do they call it, lacuna. So like these spaces between words where just the papyri or whatever has worn out or just dissolved, and he's an expert on how much space you would need, so he can detect forgeries. So there was one he mentioned, I forget which one it is, that fairly recently has been that for a long time people were like, oh, this is great, this is early whatever century in, I think, in late antiquity. And he's like, no, there's not enough space for these words to fit, so this must be a piece of papyrus that carbon, in terms of carbon dating, dates back to that time period, but somebody's put in wrote in the script on very old or a papyrus. And then the example, this I think was in the debate between Billy Carson and Wes Huff, which is kind of what gave birth to the Joe Rogan interview, where it starts off, if you want to see an example of a con man in the world of religion and that sort of stuff, this was like right from the get-go. Huff, with a smile on his face, and with all gentleness and respect, exposes this guy as an absolute fraud. He starts off by making some claim, like within the first couple minutes, that there is evidence that Jesus was not crucified on the cross, and he refers to what he calls the Sinai Bible, and then Huff asks him to clarify, what are you talking about? Are you talking about the Codex Sinaiticus or what? And then this guy Billy Carson says, oh, what I meant was the Gospel of Barnabas. And Wes Huff says, wait, that's a 14th century forgery that everybody knows is a forgery. Then he's like, well, and then he gives an example from this Gospel of Jesus' wife, which is a 21st or maybe it's a 21st century forgery that uses papyrus from the first, which I guess it's from the 2nd or 3rd century actually, that somebody copied from a PDF. On their computer, they took the script from that PDF and wrote it onto that old papyrus, which included some errors in that PDF. So but even a Harvard scholar like Karen King, like a well-known scholar of non-canonical gospels and so on, vouched for that forgery for a while. It wasn't career-ending for her; it should have been, but it did certainly lose her a lot of credibility. How could that not end your
career? My Lord.
Yeah,
we know
that's
that.
The thing with this guy, Billy Carson, I don't know who the heck he is, so I did a little searching. Apparently he's got, he's quite arrogant. He owns like space-type companies, and he's got a lot of money, brags about it quite a bit. But he also has a certificate from MIT in neuroscience, and then a certificate from Harvard in ancient civilizations. And what it shows you is that letters behind a name, institutions, reputable institutions, or institutions that had good reputations in the past, that don't mean squat anymore if the facts or the evidence doesn't support whatever it is you're claiming. And that, I think, is like one of the great takeaways from the Carson Huff debate and Rogan interview of Huff, is that this stuff, the evidence Christians have nothing to fear from the evidence. And that should lean strongly into presenting the evidence for the historicity, the truthfulness of Jesus' resurrection and his claims to deity and the rest of it.
A lot of
stop for now.
The experts supposedly around the debunking of the Bible or of New Testament studies, and employ not just like literary critical theory, but critical presuppositions of power. We've talked about on the show before, sort of Marxist stuff that means that the Bible, it used to be the Bible's impossible because of miracles. Now it's the Bible's inaccurate because the people who handed us the Bible were the ones in power.
Yeah, that was always going to be the worry, like back in the day with postmodernism, right, coming in, and is that all the Bible wasn't necessarily going to be, it wasn't going to be like a materialist objection that miracles couldn't happen. It was going to be that there was just so much bias in the reporting of what happened that you could never trust it.
And so people want to believe, like whether it's Carson or these New Testament scholars or whatever, that a forgery from the 21st century is true because it undoes what the Bible says.
It shows it shows the bias.
Yeah, or that Barnabas would, the Gospel of Barnabas needs to be true for some of these people because it would contradict the synoptics. And that, I'm glad that stuff like that, through this exposure, is being put on display for people, because it's hard. Like the scientism of our age means that experts with letters or who can talk about that with confidence can sneak those presuppositions in and just call it science. So now science includes the presupposition that if the authority of the church handled the Bible, it must be incorrect because that's an authority that would have put dissenting voices down. And so the dissenting voices must be correct because of the dynamics of power. Yeah. And somebody like Huff just does a great job because of the textual history. It shows
he just knows it like the back of his hand.
This actually doesn't really have to do with dynamics of power. Yeah. Like those texts just don't exist.
Yeah. It was great. And it's just like emotionless too. Just like I'm not upset about any of these things. It's just this is kind of ridiculous because of X, Y, and Z. And let me tell you about this text, and let me tell you about naming and how that. I was like, man, this is good stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
Did you have any?
He's talking about how he did he say he taught himself Akkadian or something like that?
Yeah.
He tried to teach himself Sumerian.
The thing that he said that I thought was actually pretty good is that he spent a year trying to teach himself Greek, and then he took a Greek class and he found out how inadequate it was to just teach yourself Greek. He said a couple other things about learning Greek and Hebrew that I thought was pretty awesome. He said when you first start out, Greek is easy because there's a lot of cognates. And you can kind of recognize the alphabet, but once you get deeper into Greek, it becomes harder. And Hebrew is the exact opposite, because at the beginning, fewer cognates, the alphabet's more difficult to pick up. But once you pick up, it is easier because there's just less to it. There's less to learn there. And so the deeper you get into it, the easier it gets. I thought that was great. I thought it was awesome when Rogan's like, and who could even ever figure out where to learn Hebrew? And he's like, oh, actually, you can take
every university
in North America. You can take Hebrew at every graduate school in North America. I thought that was awesome. I was like, yeah, you can. Especially ones that have any kind of like connection to a classics program or something like that. Sure. And even easier, by the way, if people are listening, even easier to find a place that'll teach you Greek.
Yeah.
Did you have any criticism? I have one criticism, but I'm curious to see if you have any criticism. I just want to state, in case Wesley Huff ever listens to this, I'm doing a criticism here as an armchair guy that if I ever did get the opportunity to do something like this, would take it and would probably mess up a couple places. And I know that. So this is not like a deep criticism. This is not like, I think you did a bad job. You did an amazing job overall. It's just, there's one thing that I heard. But anyway, I was going to ask Adam first. Do you have any criticisms?
I in listening to it, was looking for things, just so we'd have something to talk about. And I don't know. I can't recall anything. I mean, I thought it was just absolutely wonderful. I mean, Kelsey is having me write a blog piece on this. So that's my work over the weekend, and I was listening pretty closely because I was, I want to have something to talk about, and I just think it was as some other YouTube channels, I guess, or whatever they're called, is calling it. It was a masterpiece or a masterclass in Christian apologetics. Both the debate with Billy Carson and the conversation with Rogan.
It sounds like the debate was. I don't know if I'd call it a masterclass in Christian apologetics. He did a great job in Christian apologetics, but it's not like it was a masterclass is formulaic, start here, go to there. It wasn't
that's
that.
What they're using the term rhetorically, I think.
It was a masterful conversation in the art of apologetics. I'll give him that.
Yeah.
Like hard down. I mean, like just hardcore. My one critique is a very Montgomeryan critique from Sensible Christianity, and it's where Montgomery warns people to be careful not to give somebody a problem they don't already have. And I thought there was one area where he possibly did that. It's when Joe Rogan was asking about, it was kind of in that same vein as did Jesus die and all that. And it was just a little bit after that. And they start talking about the fact that Wesley Huff first says something to the kin that ancient people weren't dumb. They knew when people were dead. Right. And we say that all the time, right? When you're doing apologetics, one of the things that you can point out that people assume that ancient people were stupider than you because you have all this education available to you and you didn't. They're illiterate peasants, as sort of the famous, I forgot that cosmologist guy said. And then he starts going into this idea that these ancient people. So anyway, my point is that you use that in an apologetic conversation to say they're not different than us. They knew when people were dead, and they didn't expect dead people to start walking around again 3 days later. Right? They weren't dumb. They knew when a dead person was put in the ground, they stayed in the ground, and that's where they were. Right? And that they're going to rot. And you can use the examples of like Lazarus and Jesus saying, "Come out," and Mary going, "He's going to stink. You know, he's already started to rot. What are you doing?" Right? So you can use all of these examples in here. And that's usually the path that you go with that. And then Wesley Huff, right after that, started saying how ancient people would have been much more expecting for miraculous things to happen than we are, that they were more accepting of miraculous things like a resurrection than we are. Now, he could be right, but in the way I've always been taught to have that conversation, you don't actually say that. And I think from the biblical text, it's pretty clear that when Jesus turns water into wine, people are pretty shocked by it. Like when he raises Lazarus from the dead, people are pretty shocked by it. They're like overwhelmingly shocked by it. When he makes blind people see, deaf people hear, lame people walk, they're pretty overwhelmingly shocked by it. I mean, if you read the Gospel of Matthew, every time he does one of these miracles, people are not like, yeah, this kind of stuff happens every day. They're more like, holy cow, what the heck is this guy doing? Right? And in fact, they'll even get mad at him for doing it sometimes, like thinking that he's like bringing in demons and stuff like that. So I thought that was kind of interesting, and it wasn't where Joe Rogan was going. And then all of a sudden, Joe Rogan kind of picked up on that and kind of said, "Oh, well, this is what I'm talking about. They're much more willing to accept this kind of crazy stuff happening that obviously doesn't happen than we are."
I do think so. I mean,
anyway,
I think there was something to that in the sense that he was talking about because he brought up that we have a modernist bias against miracles that is pretty novel in the scope of human history.
I agree.
And I think that's true, and that the acknowledgement of the supernatural can't just be ruled out. And Rogan had been talking about that too from the very beginning. Now, the thing is, I actually kind of liked that section because I thought it was an important theological shift in the conversation, which is, what does the miracle mean, and why that's still because they were talking about what was the biggest objection to Christianity from Romans, from Greeks, from the various pagans around, and it was, you worship a man who died. Now that means that they're obviously not believing that the resurrection happened.
That you would worship a God that was crucified.
Yeah. Now that means that those critics, those early critics, are essentially saying a resurrection didn't happen, or something like that. But I do think it is an important theological shift that helped him get to the gospel then even later.
That's
which
interesting.
is to say that we have Christianity is built up on a ridiculous proposition. Our God is not appealing in the traditional sense of the gods. He died. He's an embarrassment. He's not offering crops.
I get
and
all that.
riches
I just heard it put something into Joe's head that was a path that Joe didn't seem like he was going on his own. As a sort of like a distinction between they accepted stuff that we could never accept. And I remember him saying almost something specifically like that, and maybe not those exact words. And I thought, okay, I got the shift. He did make a shift because that's when he started talking about theology proper, right? Which also to me seemed like the portion of the 3 hours that Joe Rogan was the least interested in. But I mean, he was really interested in all the mystery stuff and all of the answering ancient questions and what can this text tell us about stuff we don't already know, all that kind of stuff. When it kind of got to like the proper theology, there felt like a little, I could be wrong, it felt like a little bit of a checkout. And again, if people are hearing this, I'm not claiming that I could go on there and do this better than he could. I couldn't. He did an amazing job. There was a Montgomery bell going off on my head at that moment when he made that shift. That wasn't the result of a specific question that he asked. He made the shift, and something seemed like it went off in Rogan's head that hadn't been there before. That was not necessarily a positive argument for Jesus actually being dead and actually rising from the dead. That's all I'm saying.
On a kind of a related note concerning the anti-supernatural bias and those sorts of things, one thing that I thought was interesting, I've heard it before in the past, I don't remember where both Wes Huff and Joe Rogan were commenting on the that while people find something like a virgin birth absurd, they do still believe in the virgin birth of the universe. And so,
was great.
I think it was early on in the conversation where it was
actually right after that part towards the end.
Okay, well, but at the beginning when Wes Huff was talking about his that miraculous recovery from paralysis, when they're talking about how if you believe that the universe came from nothing, it's not so hard to believe in like a miracle like recovering from paralysis, right? Like the Big Bang is truly miraculous if it didn't happen from some sort of cause, a supernatural, if you will, cause.
Kind of middle of the show, he says something like that regarding water into wine, and it's right as they're talking about like it's right in the cosmology section, right? And they're talking about all of this, and Wesley Huff points out that when the Big Bang Theory was first produced, there were some strict materialists that like heard Genesis 1 and 2 in there, and they were like, I'm not sure we can do this. This sounds way too much like the Bible. And that was it. And then he points out, he goes, they actually connected the dots, that if you could believe that the universe came, boom, out of nothing, that it was not such a big leap to believe that Jesus could turn water into wine. And I was like, that's really good. Yeah, and then towards
go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. No, go ahead.
Well, I think when he didn't name him, but I'm pretty sure he was referring to Fred Hoyle, who coined the term Big Bang, because he was mocking this theory that Edwin Hubble and others were starting to develop. He goes, they're talking about some sort of Big Bang causing everything, mocking it because all this. If you do have a universe springing from nothing, at least according to the sort of practical procedures of science, the question is, well, where did it come from? And he knew exactly what the implications were in positing a temporal as opposed to an eternal universe. But yeah. Sorry, I interrupted.
How did you feel about the age stuff and the like base 12 stuff and all of that? Because apparently online, that's from like ultra conservative guys. He's getting some heat for maybe suggesting that people, that had very old ages in the Old Testament.
Well, I think it's from people who said, like he said, I'm not sure the genealogies in the Bible exist to determine the age of the earth, which statement I completely agree with
that too.
But I've been seeing some more. I don't like slinging the word fundamentalist around because it can mean so many different things. But we'll
Plus,
just say
I was called a fundamentalist.
I'll just say, like there are certain types of Christians who are upset about that.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting. Like he didn't do it definitively, and I love that. Like he gave options to people, right? And he did the exact same thing that Montgomery does again in Sensible Christianity around that section when they were talking about evolution. He goes, "That's not what I believe." Like obviously, this guy's like a 6-day creation kind of guy, which is great. That's me too. But he goes, but there are, and this is exactly the type of thing Montgomery says in Sensible Christianity. I know Christians who are sincere Christians who believe in the death and resurrection of Christ for them that have a different view on this than me. And I was like, that is that is the type of humility you have to have in this kind of conversation.
Yeah. Yeah.
I do like too that there was an apparent, he was able to make, I think, the important theological point when you're talking about apologetics of the Old Testament and this ancient knowledge and stuff, which is the Bible is revelation for a purpose.
That's
it's the
right.
promises that God makes that he then wants recorded and handed down to his people. It's not there to answer every mystery of the ancient world or every question you have. And if you start treating it only like that, you're not using it as, it's not scripture anymore. It's not why God gave it. And that is pretty strong. Now, that's not to say that the archaeology in it is untrue or the dates and places or whatever. It's just saying that the purpose is not a handbook to your curiosity of the ancient world. The purpose is to, from all of time, deliver the promise of the forgiveness of sins, the coming Messiah, the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ for you, for the forgiveness of those sins. And I just don't see getting mad at that. Now, I know a lot of people who think it's a handbook to all of the knowledge possibly contained in the entire universe. And that's always ridiculous. Like, you can't read the Bible and learn what the boiling temperature of water is, or that you need to stop at a stop sign. So, like a bunch of different things.
Or how to teach Adam to turn down his microphone.
Or what the bricks were made out of in Egypt. Or how to make Roman concrete or whatever.
But he gave so many like precise clues that he believes, in, I would even say, the complete authority and even inerrancy of the scriptures. Like when he was talking about the sudden appearance of certain languages, like we don't have any way to learn them because they appeared and then they disappeared, they were gone. We don't know where they come from. They're not similar to the X, Y, or Z. And he goes, yeah, there's a story of the Tower of Babel, and all of a sudden, like God, they're speaking one language and he breaks it all up and he breaks it into a bunch of different languages. He's like, yeah, it seems like the record indicates that something like this absolutely happened.
Well, and when he talked about history as probability too, it's like, what's the most probable explanation that we have? Tower of Babel at this point is the most probable explanation. It's the most historical explanation.
I thought that was great. I just thought that kind of thing was just very, very good. The type of thing that somebody like Joe Rogan is just going to love hearing too. Playing to his strengths and his interest, which is absolutely what you do in an apologetic conversation. My hope for this conversation with Joe Rogan is that it continues.
Yeah.
Because I know that conversations like this have to happen over the course of time, and Joe Rogan needs to hear the gospel again and again, and that we trust that the Holy Spirit will work on him and be efficacious through it.
Can we talk about how there was, in the last 2 minutes, a shift?
That was so good.
Like there's a shift to what we've talked about before with apologetics. Where,
calls Jordan Peterson wrong.
Yeah, where
I liked that part.
He uses that as a transition to talk about what Jesus is really teaching.
Well, and it's preceded by a question the Gospels, all three of the Synoptic Gospels ask. Who do you say that I am? And
that's right.
And Huff says, so what do you think about Jesus?
That was so good.
I was like, oh my.
That was so good.
Yeah.
Good job, Wesley Huff.
And it was outstanding. Hey, can I ask a hypothetical? So what? You didn't answer yet, but I'm just going to assume you're going to say yes. I can ask a hypothetical question. How do you think? We've talked in the past about different approaches to Christian apologetics, and we'll usually pit like evidentialism against presuppositionalism. How do you think this would be assessed by a strict presuppositionalist? I think
probably negative.
Hypothetical, but
I think
so?
negatively because it's one of the presuppositions within presuppositionalism is that it's going to be Joe Rogan's inability to understand any of the sort of really meaningful parts of this because he's not yet a believer.
Yeah.
And that the task of Wesley Huff here would be to basically break down Rogan's current worldview in order to start, then introducing him, then just to preaching to him at that point. And then once he's converted, you can sort of then do catechetics with him with some of this other stuff that he was doing as apologetics, and evangelism, and not as catechetics.
It would have had to be a more debate style, right? So when I watched that, I think the thing with the presuppositional in this case was it would have had to have been a more antagonistic conversation about what some of Joe's beliefs about evolution or the ancient world or the Bible or the resurrection of Jesus or whatever, then Wesley just sort of plainly stating what he believes and what the Christian church confesses and what history knows is true.
Yeah.
And so I don't know. I feel like there's but in the same time, it's not like, I think it was that order, which is, here's my, I confess certain things. This is what the church has taught, and history
backs it up,
knows that it's true, not the other way around in that sphere. And I think that's a very strong, and that's, again, you just have to know the material. You have to be a well-catechized Christian. He knows Christian history.
Like I said,
he knows
he's
at least enough about the Reformation.
He's an excellent theological generalist, right?
Yeah.
He could talk about Erasmus and Luther a little bit.
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
He could talk about
that's awesome.
Some specifics of cosmology a little bit. He could talk about his field immensely. And then when it got into the gospel itself and even law and gospel itself, he did a great job. He says, because he brings up Jordan Peterson, and Joe Rogan says, what do you think about him? And he goes, well, I think that he's wrong in his basic assumption about who Jesus is, that Jesus was basically, a mythical moral archetype of an example that we should follow. He goes, these are the exact people that Jesus rebukes time and again in the gospel. And Rogan says, why? Yeah. And he goes, because of their presumption that they could clean themselves through the law. And he sort of dials down the law on them so much so that they see that it's a mirror. And he literally, he's got great lines, and just absolutely just banger lines in there.
Yeah.
A mirror doesn't clean you. It shows you that you're dirty. If you want to get clean, don't look in a mirror, take a shower. Anybody else hear baptism in there? I mean, baptism was ringing in my ears, and I was like, good job, man. But that's exactly where then Rogan's like, all right, that's all the time we have for today, which is why I want the conversation to continue.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I
think this is very different in demeanor than our conversation up until this point. But I think for those that are watching this or listening to this, maybe this is kind of schmaltzy. I don't think it is. Wouldn't it be incredible if every Christian that is listening to this prayed for Joe Rogan every day?
Oh, yeah, that's not schmaltzy.
I know, but it's like we've been talking about evidence and all this stuff, and then all of a sudden, boom. But
dear Lord Jesus, bring more and more people into Joe Rogan's life that can proclaim to him the unadulterated good news as clearly and as forcefully as Wesley Huff did.
Yeah.
Amen.
Yeah. Well,
I can't wait for I can't wait for Huff to be called an antinomian for clearly articulating Lex Semper Accusat on the air.
That's so good.
Any Lutherans out there worried that Huff is a secret radical Lutheran, please make sure to write a huge long Facebook posts about how the law is really meant to encourage Christians to be good.
And how that would have actually helped Joe Rogan.
Do you think
that the mirror turns into a sponge once you're a Christian and you can clean yourself with it? Yeah. Please.
Do you think there will be any criticisms from the, of Wes Huff not clearly articulating a monergism? Being more of a, you know what I'm saying?
I've already seen Roman Catholics criticize that ending.
Okay, interesting.
Like I said, I've seen some, air quotes here, fundamentalist Christians criticize his accounts of the Old Testament. So it's not been totally. And then
I hope and pray my small criticism didn't come across that way. I say it humbly. And good job, Wesley Huff, on all parts.
And the other one I've seen, which kind of goes to your opening and why I was joking, Adam, was these Christians who are like, no Christian should go on Joe Rogan while he still swears. Get the heck out of here.
Get that.
Just
more than
pull
heck
the
out
broomstick out of your butt cheeks. And this is, you obviously do not know what the second commandment actually means. I'm so sick of Christians who don't understand what swearing and using God's name in vain actually mean. Maybe it's low class, but it's not. He's a
comedian.
It's not unchristian and it's not sinful.
He's a comedian. And he spent 3 hours having an honest conversation with a rabid Christian about the faith and about the authority of the scriptures. I mean, come on.
And by the way, if Huff had thrown in like an F-bomb in there, it wouldn't have done any damage to his testimony except to tightwad Christians who already care about that stuff. So It's ridiculous.
He didn't. Good restraint.
Yeah,
that would have been hard. That would have been hard for me.
Yeah, I would have been.
He was. Yeah,
he kept it classy.
Here we still stand. Just to put a little thing in your
if we could get him, that'd be great.
All right, guys.
We'll send the invitation. Do you think he sounds like he might actually have something to say on the bondage of the will?
Yep, but he seems like quite a busy guy traveling around.
Well, I'm sure he's about to be busier than he's ever been in his life.
Yeah, absolutely. Good job, Wesley Huff. Again, please take my mild criticism with all humility on my part, knowing that I could not have done the job that you did through that show. Awesome, good work.
Great. Well, we will catch you next time, guys. Hopefully, I think we're going to be able to get this up as a video for the General 1517 YouTube channel. So if you're interested in that and you're a regular Thinking Fellows listener, go over to YouTube. I'm going to drop this in I'm not going to wait the regular weeks to drop this in. So this will be sort of a quick episode turnaround for our regular listeners. We hope you enjoyed it. Go to 1517.org to find more from us. And there, too, you can find theological and apologetic resources, theological generalists aplenty there over at 1517.org. Thank you for listening. We'll catch you next time. Bye.
Bye.